The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the dark night, piercing the cold air outside Birmingham, Alabama. Lieutenant Colonel Alicia Dawson was yanked roughly, her wrist stinging as Officer Johnson tightened the cuffs, steering her towards the white patrol car parked along the highway. The flashing red lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting a stark, unwavering light onto her composed yet steely face. She didn't struggle, didn't scream, just walked in silence, her eyes gleaming with an unyielding resolve. Johnson smirked, slamming the car door shut behind her, the lock clicking like a final seal on her fate within the rigid compartment. Outside, he muttered something into his radio, his tone smug. But in the darkness, through the tinted glass, Alicia stared straight into the rearview mirror, her own faint reflection gazing back. No fear, just a smoldering fire. Why was she here? What had led to this moment? Before we delve into this story, tell us where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, crafted just for you. The story rewinds to a few hours earlier, when the neon lights first appeared in Alicia's rearview mirror. We thought you were just another black woman we could rough up, until you walked into the Batcave funeral home. The night road was nearly deserted, a few cars gliding past, their headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Flickering lights cast long shadows on the highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, just past 11 p.m., an hour when most people just wanted to be home. Lieutenant Colonel Alicia Dawson had been driving for nearly an hour, her fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel, humming along to the smooth rhythm of an old jazz tune playing through the speakers. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She didn't stand out, or at least she thought she didn't. Then she saw the flashing neon lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, closing in fast. Her stomach clenched, not from fear, she knew how these encounters went, but from sheer exhaustion. She signaled, switched lanes, and slowly pulled onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, took a slow breath, and made sure her hands were visible. She'd been in the military long enough to know the drill. A white patrol car stopped right behind her. The officer fumbled as he got out. When he finally did, he moved with the swagger of a man expecting deference, his heavy boots crunching on the asphalt, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a flashlight that cut through the darkness as he approached. She tilted her head slightly, watching him through the rearview mirror. The name on his badge caught the light, Johnson. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, practiced, devoid of warmth. Alicia looked straight into his eyes in the mirror, then slowly reached into the glove compartment, retrieving her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Johnson didn't answer immediately. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he glanced over her car. "Broken taillight," he said. She frowned. "That can't be right." Johnson finally looked at her. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed. Alicia could feel the shift in the air, that unspoken, quiet moment where power met resistance, and one side was expected to yield. She'd seen this before, during field exercises at overseas bases, in training simulations preparing sailors to face the world beyond the Navy. She knew better than to push, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just stating," she replied, her voice level. "My taillights were inspected a few weeks ago, but if there's an issue, I can have it fixed." "Step out of the car," Johnson interrupted, as if he hadn't heard a word she said. Alicia suppressed a sigh. She scanned the road ahead, no witnesses. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. "Could you please tell me why?" she asked. Johnson tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "Because I said so." She let the moment hang in the air for a beat, then unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she'd expected. She stepped onto the asphalt, loose but coiled, wary. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wasn't about to be railroaded either. Johnson took a step back, his eyes sweeping over her. She could feel his assessment, gauging how far he could push. "Turn around, hands on the car." This time, she complied. No point in escalating unnecessarily. Johnson moved closer, his smirk gone. "Are you resisting?" Alicia held her ground. "No, I'm asking a question." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, annoyance, amusement, maybe both. Then, without warning, he barked into his radio. "We've got an uncooperative driver here." Static crackled through the speaker, then louder, "Turn around." Her heart rate quickened, but her expression remained neutral. "Officer, I need to make something clear," she said, her voice low but firm. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I also know exactly what you're not." Johnson didn't like that, his jaw tightening. "You're under arrest," he snarled, reaching for her wrist. Alicia moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grasp. "Arrested for what?" Johnson lunged. "For obstructing an officer." She let out a sharp exhale through her nose. So that was the game. Her military instincts kicked in, her heartbeat steadying, her breathing even. She knew she had two choices: comply and fight it later, or resist and risk escalation. She couldn't become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of the car. The cold metal pressed against her palms. Johnson wasted no time, yanking her hands behind her back, the handcuffs biting into her wrists as he tightened them, before steering her towards the patrol car. "You have no idea what you're doing," she stated flatly. Johnson chuckled, shoving her into the back seat. "Honey, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he was wrong, utterly wrong. The hard plastic of the car seat dug into her back. Alicia sat motionless, her wrists stinging from the cuffs, her breathing even. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. Outside, Johnson sauntered back to his car, muttering something into his radio. She stared at the partition separating them, the faint reflection of her face gazing back, calm, composed, but beneath it, something simmering. She'd been through combat drills, high-risk operations, and interrogations in foreign territories, but this was different. This was a man wearing a badge, drunk on power, believing himself untouchable. Minutes ticked by, then 5, then 10. She shifted her hands slightly, testing the cuffs, too tight, regulation issue. The driver's side door opened, and Johnson slid in, whistling. Well, he drawled, pulling the seatbelt across his chest. "Let's go for a little ride, shall we?" She didn't respond. He put the car in drive, pulling off the shoulder and back onto the road. The patrol car sped forward, the flashing lights on its roof casting an eerie glow. She could see the red and blue reflections in the rearview mirror, painting the road behind them in alternating hues. "You know," Johnson said after a moment, "most people get pretty worked up when I tell them to get out of the car." Alicia exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for asking a question during a traffic stop." Johnson laughed, shaking his head. "Honey, who do you think you are?" She met his gaze in the mirror. "I don't think, I know." That shut him up, if only for a moment, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. A flicker of something, unease, perhaps, crossed his smug facade, but he quickly masked it. "You're military, aren't you?" he asked, his tone shifting. She didn't answer. "Yeah, I thought so," he continued. "You've got that attitude, the law and order type." He scoffed. "Bet you think I'd back down if you flashed that badge of yours, huh?" Still, she remained silent. Johnson sneered. "Too bad," he muttered, shaking his head. "If you just cooperated, we could have avoided all this." Her jaw tightened, the injustice of it all grating on her nerves, as if a power-tripping bully could somehow be her fault. The station loomed ahead, a gray brick building set back from the main road. The parking lot was nearly empty, the late evening shift winding down, and now she seemed to be its only guest. Johnson parked in a designated spot near the entrance, turned off the engine, and glanced back at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he drawled, "I love it when they make things easy." Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door shut behind him. A second later, her door opened. "Let's go," he commanded. Alicia flexed her wrists as she stepped out, the handcuffs digging into her skin, his grip not loosening. She held her head high as he guided her inside, past a stone-faced desk sergeant and into the processing room. The holding area smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a long metal bench running along the far wall, a steel door leading to the cell block just beyond. Johnson removed her handcuffs just long enough to run her through fingerprinting, mugshots, and record checks, the whole routine. The officers behind the desks barely looked up, just going through the motions. She'd seen this kind of apathy before, the kind that allowed bad cops like Johnson to thrive. When it was over, he gripped her wrists again, leading her towards the cells. "Think you're so smart, don't you?" he hissed, his breath hot on her ear. She looked straight ahead. "I don't have to think." He shoved her forward, and she felt the sting of humiliation. "Enjoy your stay," Johnson sneered, pushing her into the cell. Alicia caught her balance before she stumbled, turning to see the metal bars slide shut between them. Johnson smirked from the other side, tapping his fingers against the bars before walking away. The lock clicked shut. She took a slow breath and sank onto the bench. The cold metal seeped through her jeans, making her shiver. One night, just one night was all it would take. Little did Johnson know who he was dealing with. The metal bench was cold, hard, unyielding. Alicia shifted slightly, rotating her shoulders to ease the encroaching stiffness. The cell was sparse, just 4 walls, a single flickering bulb, and the lingering scent of stale sweat and disinfectant. She had endured nights in far worse conditions, in places where the threat wasn't just discomfort but genuine danger. This was nothing. But that didn't mean she wasn't seething. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmur of officers chatting at the front desk, the occasional rustle of papers, the clink of a coffee mug against a desk. She breathed slowly and evenly, controlling her breath, controlling her mind. Basic training drilled into her long before she ever donned a uniform. Heavy footsteps approached. Johnson, she knew it was him even before he appeared, his stride carrying the familiar arrogant rhythm of a man who thought himself invincible. He appeared at the cell front a moment later, arms crossed over his chest, that familiar smirk plastered across his face. Comfortable? She didn't reply. He tilted his head, leaning closer to the bars. You know, if you just cooperated a little, you wouldn't be in here. She let a slow smile curve her lips. Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. Johnson's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, uncertainty, before he quickly masked it, scoffing as he glanced around the empty holding area. No one's coming to get you tonight, sweetheart. He shrugged. Guess you'll have plenty of time to think about that attitude of yours. Alicia simply watched him, unmoving, unfazed. Johnson leaned forward slightly. Listen, here's the thing, he continued, lowering his voice. People like you think the law doesn't apply to them. You think a little swagger is enough to get you out of trouble. She let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter, because he had no idea what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached from down the hallway, a younger guy, maybe late 20s, wearing the standard uniform. He stopped a few feet away, holding a clipboard. Sergeant. The officer's voice held a hint of hesitation. We've got a call. Johnson barely glanced at him. The officer shifted, shuffling his feet. And I think you need to see this. Johnson frowned, then gave Alicia one last look before walking away. She leaned back, listening. The conversation was hushed, but she caught snippets, something about a lawyer, a call from higher-ups, questions about the grounds for her detention. Johnson's voice dropped, sharp and irritated. The younger officer stammered a reply, but whatever it was, it clearly didn't please Johnson. Then, the heavy footsteps returned. Johnson stormed back, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The smirk was gone. What the hell did you do? Alicia leaned forward, resting her hands on her knees. I didn't do anything. She tilted her head slightly. But people talk, and some of those people have friends in very high places. Johnson's face darkened. She could see it now. The moment panic began to creep in, the shift in power, he was no longer in control. He whirled, spitting out an order under his breath, and disappeared down the hallway. Alicia sighed. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came out, Johnson would regret every decision that led him here. Dawn filtered through the narrow windows of the building, casting long streaks across the polished floor. The air inside was still cold, the kind that seeped into your bones if you sat still for too long. Alicia stood near the processing desk, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. She was no longer in handcuffs, no longer in an orange jumpsuit, no longer in a cell, just a tailored navy blazer, a simple blouse, and an air of undeniable authority. She wasn't alone. Beside her, Sarah Whitman, her lawyer. She flipped through a stack of documents, barely looking up as people filed in and out of the processing room. The woman was efficient, methodical, no wasted movements, no idle chatter. Alicia liked that. The heavy wooden door at the rear of the processing room opened, and Johnson walked in. Still carrying himself like he owned the room, shoulders squared, head held high, but there was a difference now, a hesitation in his step, a flicker in his expression that hadn't been there before. No longer so sure of himself. Alicia caught his eye, and he looked away. Good. The judge entered, the room falling silent. Judge Michael Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he sat down. He wasted no time. Right, he sighed, reviewing the file. Let's get started. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have reason to believe the defendant, Lieutenant Colonel Alicia Dawson, was detained unlawfully without just cause. Furthermore, new information has uncovered a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Johnson. Murmurs rippled through the room. Johnson shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The judge peered over his glasses. "Sergeant Johnson, care to explain?" Johnson leaned forward, his voice strained. "Your Honor, the stop was valid, a routine traffic stop." The prosecutor scoffed. "Valid?" he retorted, pulling a document from his desk. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career, a graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no prior arrests, no outstanding warrants. Are you telling me that, despite all this, she posed such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight? Johnson opened his mouth, then fell silent. The silence stretched. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. "Furthermore, an internal review of your arrest history has revealed a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The murmuring grew louder, Johnson's face darkening. Judge Kirkland set the file down, his expression stern. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Johnson leaned back, crossing his arms. She was resisting. The prosecutor scoffed. "The body cam footage suggests otherwise." Another wave of noise washed over the room. Johnson looked at the judge, now openly defensive. "I was following standard procedure." Judge Kirkland wasn't buying it. He steepled his fingers. "Please play the footage." A screen lowered at the front of the processing room, and a video began to play. Alicia didn't turn to watch. She had lived through it. Johnson's aggressive commands, her own calm voice, the unnecessary escalation, the way he had smugly tightened the handcuffs. The room was utterly silent when the footage ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, his expression grave. "Sergeant Johnson, you violated procedure. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial report." Johnson opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't finished. "Lieutenant Colonel Dawson's detention is hereby dismissed." He brought his gavel down, sharp and decisive. "And I'm recommending an internal investigation into Sergeant Johnson's actions." The tension in the room snapped like an overstretched rubber band. Johnson looked as though he'd been punched in the gut, his face flushed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Alicia simply stood, composed, controlled. She never had any doubt. As she gathered her belongings, she gave Johnson one last look. Their eyes met, no words exchanged. They didn't need to be, for this time, she wasn't the one fighting for her reputation. Johnson stormed out of the processing room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways. His face was tight, his features rigid. He could feel the sudden shift in gaze upon him. The other officers, the staff, even the civilians who had arrived after word of the stop had spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to walking into a room and commanding respect or fear. But now, the power he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. And then, the worst possible thing happened. "Sergeant Johnson," a sharp voice cut through the hum of the hallway, and he turned. Chief Eldon Baker stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been with the police force for over 30 years, a respected figure in the department. His words carried weight. Johnson straightened. Chief Baker regarded him for a moment, then gave a curt nod, signaling for Johnson to follow him into a private office. As soon as the door closed, the chief's tone dropped. "What the hell were you thinking?" Johnson took a sharp breath. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Chief Baker scoffed, sliding a file across the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "Doesn't look like it from here. The body cam footage, your arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting." Johnson's nostrils flared. "What's that got to do with anything?" Chief Baker leaned forward. "Everything." His voice was soft but sharp. "This isn't some ordinary woman. This is a high-ranking military officer. Did you think this was going to blow over?" Johnson looked away, his voice tight. "She was disrespectful. She questioned me." Chief Baker cut him off. "That's not a crime." Johnson scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't understand. People like that." Chief Baker's expression hardened. "People like what, Johnson?" Johnson fell silent, sputtering but saying nothing. Chief Baker sighed, rubbing his temples. "Internal Affairs is reviewing all your arrests from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you'd better believe this isn't going to go away with you." Johnson felt his stomach clench. "What does that mean?" Chief Baker straightened. "It means you're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they'll find." He shook his head. "Your career is over." The words hit Johnson like a punch to the gut. His face flushed. "That's bullshit." Chief Baker held up a hand. "Don't finish that sentence." His voice was ice cold. "Clean out your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer." Johnson stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his world crumbling before his eyes. And for the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Alicia sat in a quiet coffee shop, sipping her latte as she scrolled through her phone. The case was front-page news, the footage had gone viral, Lieutenant Colonel unlawfully arrested, officer under investigation. She wasn't surprised. She had known from the moment she stepped out of the car that night how things would unfold. She had seen men like Johnson before, entitled, arrogant, used to bending the law to their advantage. But this time, he had lost. Her phone buzzed, a text from her lawyer. Johnson has been suspended, likely facing further charges. Alicia took a slow sip of her latte. Good. She looked out the window, watching the city move around her. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the others Johnson might have harmed before. But today was a victory. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Alicia stepped out of the coffee shop. The weight of the past 24 hours should have been heavy on her shoulders, but it wasn't. She walked with her usual confidence, head high, stride firm. Her phone buzzed again, this time a number she recognized. She paused, then answered. Chief, Lieutenant Colonel. A familiar voice greeted her. I assume you've seen the news. I have. A short silence. Then, how are you feeling? Alicia glanced at her reflection in a nearby shop window. She saw no sign of defeat, no crack in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I had to do, she replied. The chief's voice was gentle. That's what I thought you'd say. A pause. The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak about it. Alicia exhaled through her nose, unsure if she relished the idea of becoming a figurehead. You're already a figurehead, the chief countered, and whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger. She knew that. She had always known that. Johnson wasn't an isolated case. He was a product of a system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe even hundreds of people who had been in her position, but didn't have her rank, her legal team, or her voice to fight back. Alicia paused at a crosswalk, watching the flow of cars. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, she said, and it won't be the last. No, the chief agreed. But it is the first time Johnson has faced consequences, and that's because you didn't back down. Alicia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. She hadn't backed down, not when Johnson pulled her over, not when he manhandled her, not when he tightened the handcuffs on her wrists, not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing that everything was stacked against her. She had held her ground, and now she had won. The chief's voice broke through her thoughts. One more thing, he added. You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Alicia's eyebrows rose. Oh, seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. She smirked. How flattering. The chief chuckled. Will you accept? Alicia considered for a moment, then shrugged. I'll think about it. She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked hand in hand with her young son, his small hand clutching hers tightly. He was laughing about something, carefree, full of life. Alicia watched them for a moment, the next generation. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for him, for every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Johnson couldn't wield their badges like weapons. She took a deep breath, then walked on, her stride firm, her purpose clear, because this fight wasn't just hers, it never had been. Unchecked power is power abused, and the only way to change the system is to fight it, to hold it accountable. What happened to Alicia happens to people every day, people without the privilege of rank, connections, or proof to back them up. That's why it's important to speak up, demand change, refuse to be silent. What would you do if you were in Alicia's shoes? Have you ever faced injustice and stood up for yourself? Share your story in the comments. Your voice can inspire and drive change. If this story made you think, please share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of justice and courage. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Every small action contributes to creating a more equitable world. Let's speak up together. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive us with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.